Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And we are going to be recording today's meeting. So just to give folks a heads up about that. But we're excited to have you all here to discuss this important topic and hear from some awesome speakers. It looks like we've already got over 50 folks joining us on the call and more folks hopping in by the moment. So really excited to have this great group. So for those that don't know me, my name is Katie Craig, and I'm the State Director with NCPIRG, and I'll be our moderator today as we hear from panelists, including clean water expert John Rumpler, community advocate Dana Sargent, and North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein, who will be joining us in a few minutes. So thank you all for being here. And as many of you on the call and joining us today already know, PFAS, aka forever chemicals, are a class of toxins that are used in our everyday products, but pose a huge threat to our health, safety, and environment. And with notorious chemical plants dumping PFAS into our waterways for the last 40 plus years here in North Carolina, our state has been ground zero for the fight against these PFAS chemicals. And NCPIRG, as well as our national network, have been working to put consumers' health and safety ahead of the power of these corporations for the last 50 years. And we're excited to be continuing this work and pulling this panel together today to hear more about the ways we're tackling this issue at the national, state, and local levels now. So first, we'll be hearing from our community organizer here in North Carolina and advocate Dana Sargent. Dana is the executive director with Cape Fear River Watch, a nonpartisan organization whose mission it is to protect and improve the water quality of the Cape Fear River Basin for all people through education, advocacy, and action. And with Chemours right in their backyard, the Cape Fear River and the surrounding region has been heavily impacted by toxic PFAS contamination. And since moving to Wilmington in 2013, Dana has been working to draw attention to this issue and help protect clean water for North Carolinians in her region and beyond. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Dana. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Katie. I need to have screen sharing capabilities. It's showing disabled on my end.
Try it again now. I just made you a copy.
Okay, there we go. All right, let's move this guy over a little bit. All right, can everybody see my screen? Katie, Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. I know we have a tight schedule, so I'm going to hop right to it. Most of us here down in Wilmington, at least in this region, remember this headline published by the Wilmington Star News in June of 2017. So we have surpassed the 5-year anniversary. It's still very much an uphill battle, but as today's huge news from the EPA, which I think John will be talking with us about later, has highlighted, the community's response and engagement continues to fuel us forward. So thank you to everyone here. So let's just take a quick step back and just figure out what the heck we're talking about here. What are PFAS? PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're man-made. They were first discovered by accident in 1938 and introduced by DuPont as Teflon in 1946. They've been known, as Katie mentioned, as forever chemicals in the regular vernacular these days because they're resistant to thermal, chemical, and biological degradation. This graph just shows some of the uses. You'll see fast food packaging, personal care products. I just was talking to my daughter about her mascara the other day. Stain-resistant products, raincoats, microwavable popcorn bags isn't on here. Obviously, nonstick cookware is a big one. Dental floss, anything that is slippery and repels water. Really, just double think. It might likely have PFAS in it. So, PFAS, of course, negatively affects our entire ecosystem. We found the stuff in our local fish, in our gators, our honey, oysters, our birds, our produce. The entire earth has been contaminated by it. And again, it doesn't degrade. It actually accumulates in organisms' bodies as you go up the food chain. 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood at some level. Here in Wilmington, North Carolina State University GenX exposure study led by Dr. Jane Hopping actually found that Wilmington residents have levels 2 and 3 times higher than national average for what they call PFOA and PFAS, which are two of the what they call legacy chemicals no longer manufactured, but again, here forever. And because environmental advocacy works really well when you show things like turtles with straws up their nose, I put this picture of this polar bear here. People love polar bears. This guy has double the concentration of PFAS than his counterparts in the North Sea because PFAS is building up in the melting sea ice, which is consumed by algae and zooplankton, and then accumulating up the food chain. So what are the risks? This graph, thankfully, Dr. Jamie DeWitt shared this with me. I think it's a really poignant image. The solid lines are showing high certainty causation directly from PFAS. The dotted lines are showing lower certainty. But, you know, we really have a lot to do in terms of work to prove causation with high certainty because our federal government requires high certainty before even beginning to regulate. So most people here know companies here in the US can make whatever chemicals they want, release them into the environment and in consumer products. And then we, the people and our friends in academia, have to figure out that the chemicals might be killing us. How do we do that? We do that by getting sick and dying. And that might trigger research from the EPA, which could trigger regulation after years of study, but it hasn't yet. We are thankful that the EPA just recently set health advisory levels for 4 PFAS, including 1 for GenX at 10 parts per trillion. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And basically 0 for those 2 legacy chemicals I mentioned, PFOA and PFAS. But these are not regulatory levels on their own. There is another way, which is followed by several other developed countries, in which rather than the public and tax-funded regulatory agencies proving something is dangerous after it's out, the company has to prove their product is safe before releasing it into the environment. I mean, what a concept, right? That is called the precautionary principle. It's unfortunately not used here yet in the US. So just to get our bearings a little bit, to kind of dig us into the Cape Fear, you'll see this picture on the left. Chemours is upriver. You'll see the river flowing down. So along with the thousands of drinking water wells contaminated, I'm getting emotional. I just spoke with 2 of them today, right before this call, a woman with cancer, very high levels in our region, and another woman whose daughter has a thyroid issue. We know that there's thousands of wells contaminated. We also know that there's about 500,000 people drinking the contaminated river water, the Cape Fear River, highly contaminated by chemours for more than 40 years, not to mention the other sources across the state and the world that people could be exposed to. So for a quick timeline of PFAS and the Cape Fear, and I'm going through this quickly, happy to talk to anybody about this. I'll leave my contact information before we leave. In 1980, DuPont at Fayetteville Works began making a product called vinyl ethers. This was discharging through water, emitting through air PFAS as byproducts until at least 2017. In 2002, from 2002 to 4, DuPont was making PFOA, the original Teflon chemical, often called C8, at Fayetteville Works, unpermitted, completely unregulated. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what they were doing with it. From 2004 to 2012, the C8 Science Panel out in Parkersburg, Virginia, or in the Parkersburg, Virginia area, they did this very long study. They linked C8 to multiple health issues, many of those that you saw in that previous slide, including cancers, thyroid issues, birth defects. In 2009, EPA directed DuPont to substitute C8 with GenX at the Fayetteville plant. Voluntarily, they asked them to do it. We have found that GenX is no safer than C8. From 2012 to 16, PFAS was found in the Cape Fear River. In 2015, DuPont spun off its chemical arm into Chemours, and they did this so that they could, in 2017, split a $670 million settlement between Chemours and DuPont. They were trying to reduce their liability. Again, in June 2017, we found out our river was contaminated. In February of 2019, a consent order was signed. Cape Fear River Watch sued the Department of Environmental Quality for not acting quickly enough, and we sued Chemours for violations of the Clean Water Act. A consent order was signed. It requires quite a bit of cleanup. It requires water filtration for well owners, which I'll get into. It requires sampling. It requires quite a lot, but it's only one small step in this big fight. In January of this year, Kate for Riverwatch and Partners announced that we had to sue the EPA. We're not happy about this, but they failed to require the company pay for epidemiological and tox studies that we asked them to, and we think they should do. In August, just last week, maybe a week and a half ago, Kate for Riverwatch and Partners filed a motion to intervene. This is legal jargon, but I'll explain it in a second. In ChemWars' challenge of an EPA health advisory level for Gen X of 10 parts per trillion, which I mentioned, and I'll just discuss in just a second. So here we are at a graph of the wells contaminated near the facility so far. The consent order requires the company to keep testing until they reach what's called non-detect, meaning they can't find it anymore, they haven't reached that. We're at about 9,500 highly contaminated wells around the facility and counting. And the lower Cape Fear sampling began in April. We've seen levels up to 1,200 parts per trillion in some of our local wells. And remember, EPA just set those health advisory limits at 10 for Gen X and near non-detect for PFOA and PFAS. So just think about 1,200 and consider the meanings of that. Relative to that ChemWars challenge, the consent order requires that they pay for a whole house granular activated carbon system or a connection to public water if they have Gen X at a level that is matching or above a health advisory level. With the health advisory level now at 10, that would require ChemWars to pay quite a lot more to install these whole house systems or hook people up to municipal lines. So obviously, being the good neighbors that they are, which I'll get into in a minute, they filed a challenge at that health advisory level, claiming it was not based on sound science. And it's pretty audacious. So again, we have requested to intervene in that challenge and we're awaiting that decision. For those of you here in New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, and Columbus on drinking water wells, please call to get your wells sampled. I'll provide that information to you. So just really quickly, I'm not going to read through all of these, but just so you have the background, the companies knew about this 50 years ago. They knew it was toxic. Their own scientists told them. So the point is, these companies will not regulate themselves. EPA in 2002 launched a priority exploration into determining the regulation of PFOA. PFOA is just one of 9,000 PFAS. It's still not regulated. They started that in 2002. Now, this is just one of the shocking quotes, and I'm just providing this as a reference for this. I highly suggest you read the book Exposure by Rob Ballott. He's the lawyer that took down DuPont and led to that massive $670 lawsuit. He's been played by Mark Ruffalo in the film Dark Waters. Here he is sitting next to my co-director, Ken Burdett, and SCLC's director at the time, Derb Carter, at an event we held here for another thing I highly recommend, which is a film called The Devil We Know. It's a documentary of this issue. This quote from his book showing that DuPont and 3M studied PFOA in 1978 on monkeys, and they found all of the monkeys given the highest dose died within a month. That was in 1978. So, most of us here in this region and up through Fayetteville, I think even up in the Triangle, have been seeing these absolutely ridiculous and infuriating commercials from ChemWars. Rather than using some of their millions of dollars in PFAS revenue to support clean water, they've been paying lawyers to fight lawsuits and creating misleading commercials. And they've even created a ChemWars Good Neighbor Facebook page and a website. It's got an email list, and I encourage you to get on it. I encourage you to visit their Facebook page and get on their email list and tell them what kind of neighbors you really think they are. And what can you do? I know I've gone through a lot really quickly. There's so much more. And I've only got 10 minutes and I don't want to step on anyone's toes. Katie will be sharing something a little bit later on an action item you can take today, but please consider getting on our email list. We send emails every other week with information about PFAS. Just visit our website at capeforriverwatch.org. In closing, I'd like to share a little bit about this guy on top of the fire truck in that middle photo there. He's my brother, Grant. He was a year and a half older than me. He was a Chicago firefighter and a US Marine, and he was an amazing person. Here's a couple pictures, firefighters saluting his casket as it arrived at the bar after his wake in Chicago because he wanted to be at his party. He also wanted a Viking send-off. So this picture down the bottom at the beach is just some of the people who loved him making that happen this past summer. The picture with me up in the top left was taken a few months before he died, December of 2019, of glioblastoma. This is brain cancer. It was diagnosed in 2017, the fall of 2017, just months after we heard about PFAS in our region, and I started researching it as part of my job. And then finding that firefighters whose main cause of death is cancer are literally wearing PFAS. It's in their gear, it's in some types of firefighting foams, it gets in their lungs when they're fighting a burning fire at a home that contains consumer products made with PFAS. He told me there's no way of knowing if PFAS was what was killing him, but he is one hero who died already, and maybe because of PFAS. There are thousands who have died from diseases already directly linked to PFAS. And yes, we need studies to directly link PFAS to firefighters and military-based exposures and people like us who live near chemical manufacturing companies, because we all need to know the truth and we deserve to know the truth so we can make choices to reduce our exposure. But we can't let one more extraordinary person die while we wait. The time to regulate is now, and we do that by showing up and speaking out. So thank you for showing up, and I think that is my time. I believe questions will be coming at the end. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much, Dana, for sharing your story and for your tireless efforts in the region and across North Carolina. We're so lucky to have you fighting with us, so thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein, who's joining us now. Since becoming Attorney General in 2017, Stein has been working to understand and take action to address PFAS chemicals and contamination, as well as holding polluters accountable. In 2020, he launched a formal investigation into PFAS contamination in the state, and since has taken actions including filing lawsuits against 14 companies responsible for producing firefighting foam containing toxic PFAS chemicals, and has also called on the US Senate and EPA to take further action as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Attorney General Stein. And before I do, I will just also say that he's a very busy man, and so we'll be taking questions for him right after he speaks, and we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions before he hops off. So if you do have questions as he's speaking, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. And thank you again so much for being here today and for your work on this important issue. I'll turn it over to you.
Katie, thank you so much. Thanks for the kind words of introduction. Thank you all for organizing today's gathering. I want to wish everybody a good afternoon. It's good to be with you all. NCPIRG has been working hard, not only in today's event, but obviously to try to improve North Carolina's lives in a number of different ways. And so I thank you all for this. When I took office as the Attorney General of North Carolina, I took an oath to protect the people of North Carolina and the state. That includes protecting our environment and natural resources. So we are working hard to protect the air that we breathe, the water we drink, and the communities we live in. Addressing PFAS contamination in North Carolina is one of the most pressing environmental issues my office is working on. Unfortunately, these forever chemicals are incredibly harmful to our health and natural resources. Their toxicity and the ability to accumulate in the environment and in our bodies without degrading are directly related to many serious health problems. Dana went through a number of the problems that PFAS can cause to people: cancers, high blood pressure, fetal developmental harm, reproductive issues, among many, many other problems. So I'd like to talk to you today about what we've been doing to hold accountable the companies that are polluting our air, water, and land. My office serves as counsel to the Department of Environmental Quality, and as Dana noted, in 2019, DEQ reached a resolution with Chemours, and my lawyers were instrumental in achieving that milestone settlement. In addition to securing the largest environmental fine in the history of the state, the settlement requires Chemours to address all sources of chemical contamination at their Fayetteville Works facility to prevent any more harm to the air, soil, or water. They have to clean up the site by removing contamination on site and provide better barriers and filtration systems to ensure that chemicals do not continue to leach into the groundwater. And they have to provide home filtration systems or clean drinking water by some other means to affected nearby homeowners. So that's the regulatory component of what the state has done regarding PFAS contamination. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. In 2020, the next year after 2019, I launched a formal investigation into the companies responsible for PFAS contamination in North Carolina, so we could really understand the extent of the damage to our natural resources. In October of 2020, I filed my first lawsuit as part of that investigation, and it was against DuPont and Chemours for what happened at the Fayetteville Works plant. We allege that DuPont knew for decades that PFAS posed significant threats to human health and the environment, and Dana had a number of data points to sustain that allegation. Workers who were exposed to PFAS with DuPont had significantly higher rates of health issues. DuPont confirmed as far back as 1980 that it knew that some of these forever chemicals were toxic and essentially indestructible in the environment. When other manufacturers stopped selling the chemical to DuPont because of how dangerous it was, DuPont started to make it on its own so that it could continue to make Teflon and other products. They continued to dump these chemicals into the Cape Fear River Basin and emit them into the air, poisoning communities in the area and downstream. They say at the same time continue to publicly deny that the chemicals were harmful. And even when they were caught by the EPA and forced to phase out one type of forever chemical, they simply switched to using another, Gen X. In 2015, DuPont transferred the Fayetteville Works facility to its subsidiary Chemours and spun that company off to try to avoid billions in potential liabilities. So I'm taking both companies to court to make them pay for the mess that they have made. We are seeking economic damages for the harms they've caused our water supplies, fisheries, and other natural resources. We're also asking the court to put a stop to the corporate shell games they're using to try to shield billions of dollars in assets from the state and the people they've harmed. It may not surprise you that the companies that we've been fighting are trying to have their lawsuit dismissed. So far, the courts have refused that request and the litigation continues. In November of last year, of 2021, I filed 4 additional lawsuits as part of this investigation into PFAS. This time it was against DuPont, but in addition to DuPont, 3M and 12 other companies that manufactured AFFF. AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, as Dana noted, is a fire suppressant. It's been used by military, airports, and firefighters. It's designed to be mixed with water and sprayed liberally. Of course, without precautionary measures, the spray freely seeps into the soil and groundwater, broadly contaminating our natural resources. The 4 cases that have been filed in North Carolina Superior Courts relate to the following contaminated sites: Charlotte Douglas International Airport, where the Air Force conducted tests at the Air National Guard base and found PFAS in the groundwater at levels well in excess of the EPA's health advisory level. The Charlotte Police and Fire Training Academy, where testing identified PFOA and PFAS at 17 different on-site groundwater wells at levels up to 1,800 times the EPA's health advisory level. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, where the Air Force has conducted testing to show PFOA and PFOS concentrations in the groundwater at levels thousands of times beyond the EPA's health advisory level. And finally, at the Stanley County Airport, which also has an Air National Guard base, where testing revealed excessive PFAS and PFOA in the soil, sediment, and groundwater. In our lawsuits, we've alleged that these 14 manufacturers of AFFF created and designed a defect that they knew or should have known was harmful, but they failed to warn their customers. They caused a public nuisance, and then again, we allege they fraudulently engaged in corporate shell games to shield their profits. We see these companies time and time use the same shady tactics to make more money. They keep making decisions to maximize their profits at the expense of people, and then trying to engage in corporate restructurings to shield those ill-gotten gains from accountability. It's wrong. We are asking the court to require these companies to investigate how widespread the damage is, clean it up, replace water treatment systems and wells that need it, and monitor future damages. My investigation into PFAS contamination is not over. We're continuing to look into these issues, and I will not hesitate to act if and when we find other locations that have been impacted or other companies that have put North Carolinians' health at risk. For a long time, I've been feeling like the state has been at this alone in conjunction with a lot of local partners. So I've been calling on the federal government to do more to regulate PFAS and to strengthen water standards to prevent contamination. I'm very grateful that our EPA administrator, who's my friend Michael Regan, a fellow North Carolinian, and he was head of the Department of Environmental Quality, who we represented in negotiating that resolution back in 2018. Under Regan's leadership of the EPA, it's taking aggressive steps to require chemical companies to test and publicly report PFAS levels in their products. That includes his announcement today. There was an announcement today to designate two types of PFAS, PFOS and PFOA, as hazardous substances. That designation is going to give people more information about contamination in their communities, and it's going to give us more tools to require polluters to clean up the contamination they cause. Additionally, the Department of Defense is looking into how to clean up PFAS contamination on military sites. I'm encouraged by these actions, and I hope that together we will be able to do more and faster to clean up contamination and to protect people's health into the future. Certain corporations let chemicals that they knew or should have known were dangerous and last forever seep into our groundwater, where it is putting people's health at risk. I will not stand by and let them get away with it. That's why I've been taking the action I've been taking. Our children and grandchildren deserve clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet. And I pledge to do my part. So I want to thank everyone for their attention this afternoon and for the work that I know that so many of you do on pressing environmental issues affecting our state so that our loved ones and neighbors can live better, healthier lives. And I'm excited to work with you all, God willing, in the months and years to come to do just that and to build a North Carolina that is safer, stronger, and healthier. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And do you have a couple minutes that we could take a few quick questions as well?
That would be fine.
Awesome. So the first question, which you alluded to a little bit already, but how will today's EPA announcement to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances, if finalized, impact North Carolina's cleanup and or litigation efforts?
I don't know yet how it'll affect North Carolina specifically in terms of our litigation or the cleanup. That's something I need to talk to my lawyers, and I hadn't had the opportunity before we got on today. But by having that designation, in law, it triggers additional requirements on the companies. And those requirements mean that we as people will be better protected.
Awesome. And we've got a couple more great quick questions. So just trying to choose a few of them here as we go. But one other question that came through the chat was, we're aware that there's proposed expansion in North Carolina. How will your office implement accountability measures with Chemours and their new plans?
Well, Chemours would have to get permitting from the Department of Environmental Quality if they're going to expand their footprint. And I am very confident that the DEQ, at least under the current administration, will ensure that the public interest is protected.
Awesome. And I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions for today. But thank you so much again for being here with us, Attorney General Stein, and for your work on this issue. We're so glad to have you on our side and working to tackle this in North Carolina. So thank you.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today and hope everybody has a great one. Take care.
And then last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Environment America's Senior Clean Water Director, John Rumpler. John is a clean water expert with years of experience working towards a safer, healthier, and cleaner water for all of us. And since starting his environmental activism as a PIRG student back in the 1980s, John has worked to protect our rivers, lakes, and streams, as well as our drinking water from pollution threats, including lead, sewage, factory farms, and of course, PFAS. John has also coordinated several successful campaigns to enact a cleanup plan for the Chesapeake Bay, enact the federal clean water rule, and implement state policies to curb off runoff pollution, and many other things as well. So thank you so much for being with us today, John. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Katie, thanks so much. And Dana, thank you again for your incredible remarks. And I think all of us, just feel terrible about the tragedy that has occurred in your region, in your watershed, and indeed in your family. And I think we all want to work as hard as possible to ensure that it never happens again, as you said before. Again, I'm John Rumpler, Clean Water Program Director for Environment America, and along with it, Environment North Carolina, our state affiliate there in North Carolina. I work with Katie and all of her counterparts across the country on a broad range of clean water issues. And listen, when we first started hearing about this problem of PFAS, I was reminded of when I first started doing this work in the 1980s as a student at Tufts University, because at that time, the top environmental issue, really nobody was talking about climate change that much. Nobody was talking about many of these other issues. The main thing that was the focus of the environmental movement's attention, and rightfully so, were toxic chemicals that were contaminating people's drinking water. Whether you're talking about Love Canal, or you're talking about a civil action in Woburn where 13 kids got leukemia, or maybe many of you remember the Erin Brockovich movie with hexavalent chromium in California. Again and again and again, we've seen these toxic chemicals by the thousands poisoning our drinking water, making people sick, and so forth. But in all of these years and decades of doing this work, I don't think we've seen anything as pervasive as PFAS. The truth of the matter is that our economy now uses these chemicals, thousands of these chemicals, in everything from nonstick pans to non-stain to food packaging to firefighting foam and gear. You heard some of the examples before. This stuff is everywhere. I mean, just as one example, even as I was preparing for today, I have to admit that as I was trying to place this little poster that says Environment America behind me, I quickly grabbed a roll of 3M tape to try to secure it to the wall. And, I don't know for sure, but I'd say it's a pretty good bet that there might have been some PFAS even in that tape moments before we got on here. We've made progress on some of those other chemical hazards, and the way we've done it, I think those past battles can inform what we need to do here and some of the actions and progress that we've heard. Really, the solution involves four things. One is we need our right to know about these toxic chemicals in our air, in our land, in our water, being stored and used in our communities, because we can't fight back and hold these companies accountable if we don't even know what they're using. So right to know. Second thing is we need to clean up existing contamination to make sure that people are not harmed from the pollution that's already happened. Third, we need to hold polluters accountable. And we heard a lot about that already, both from Dana and Attorney General Stein, so I won't say much more, but obviously we need to make it so that it no longer pays to pollute. And the only way to do that is to hold these polluters accountable. And then finally, the most important thing we need to do is prevention. Prevention ultimately means moving our economy to safer alternatives, to stopping the use of these toxic chemicals that are so ubiquitous and so persistent that if we keep using them, there's really no way to keep them from contaminating our air and land and water in a comprehensive way. The best thing is to get to the source of the problem and stop using them. Now, here's the good news. We are actually making some progress on each of these 4 points. right to know, holding polluters accountable, cleaning up current contamination, and prevention. So I want to talk about some of those pieces of progress, but most importantly, the things that are in play right now where we as activists can make a big difference. Again, holding polluters accountable. I think we heard from the Attorney General about that. I'm not going to say too much more on that point. But on right to know, for the first year in 2020, we finally had in the toxics release inventory a requirement for at least about 172 PFAS to be reported by industries, so we start to get a sense of where they're using and contaminating with these toxic chemicals. We now need EPA to expand that TRI. There's actually a loophole, believe it or not, that allows them to not report any amounts below 100 pounds of PFAS that they're using or discharging at any facility. That's insane, given what Dana was telling us about the safety levels at like 1 part per trillion, that they can just not tell us about 100 pounds. So we need to get EPA to close that loophole and dramatically expand our right to know. Second, with existing contamination being cleaned up, we already heard a little bit today from the Attorney General about the breaking news that EPA finally this morning announced that 2 key PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, are to be designated under Superfund, which can help hold polluters accountable and force the cleanup of lots of other sites of these long-standing PFAS chemicals. Now that's only been proposed just this morning, so key opportunity will be to show EPA widespread public support for not only designating those 2 PFAS chemicals, but many other PFAS chemicals under Superfund to ensure full cleanup. Just as one piece of information, EPA has already confirmed the existence of PFAS at 180 Superfund sites. So if these chemicals are not designated as hazardous, those sites will get cleaned up and the PFAS will stay there. That's insane. That's crazy. That's not cleanup. We need to fix that. And EPA has taken the first step today towards doing so. Finally, prevention. Prevention is the most important thing we can do because we need to stop the toxic tap, turn off the toxic tap at its source, not just clean up the mess that's already happened. And as I said before, what this really involves is phasing out the use of these dangerous chemicals so they don't get out into our environment. You heard before that one of the common uses of PFAS is in firefighting foam. Military bases across the country have been using PFAS firefighting foam in training drills and for fires and so forth, leading to multiple instances of contamination across the country. Finally, we worked with Congress on a bipartisan basis to order the Pentagon to phase out the use of PFAS on military bases. That should be happening in the next year or two. That was a hard-fought effort and one piece of the puzzle. In addition, at the state level, numerous states are actually now passing laws to restrict the use of PFAS. Colorado passed a widespread bill to restrict the use of PFAS in consumer products. California this week adopted legislation banning PFAS in cosmetics. Maryland passed a law banning the use of PFAS in firefighting gear that Dana talked about earlier, and Washington State as well. We need more and more states to follow, and we need EPA to follow the lead of these states in stopping the use of these toxic chemicals. On the federal level, a couple of key prevention steps that are right in front of us now. I know Congress looks like a mess. They can't stop squabbling and pointing their fingers at each other about every other issue you could imagine, but every once in a while, we can get some things done. I forgot to mention that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that Katie and I and others worked really hard to pass last year, there's $10 billion for PFAS cleanup, a good start towards the cleanup funds that are needed. But this year in Congress, surprisingly, our biggest victory might come from a bill that relates to the FDA, because attached to the FDA reauthorization bill in the Senate is now a bill that would ban PFAS in food packaging. Now, first of all, let me just say, the idea that our food would come wrapped in toxic chemicals is completely whacked to begin with. But in fact, it's a fairly widespread practice and another source of PFAS getting into our environment and contaminating our health. So this is a great step forward. There's bipartisan support to move this food packaging bill forward in the Senate. We need to show public support there. That's a critical opportunity. The other thing at EPA is we need EPA not only to do more to spur cleanup as they have today, but also to limit the ability of chemical companies like Chemours to dump these toxic chemicals into our waterways. You've already heard there's been some success in North Carolina around that, but we now need a national policy to eliminate the direct discharge of PFAS chemicals. And fortunately, Environment America and PIRG, along with our colleagues at the Southern Environmental Law Center, filed comments with EPA urging them to update what are called effluent limitation guidelines, basically pollution control standards based on technology, and showing that existing technology can get these companies to virtually eliminate their direct discharge. So under the Clean Water Act, that is what EPA is required to do. The Clean Water Act says if there's technology out there, that's how those standards should be set. So really, EPA should be moving as fast as possible. They've already agreed to review these effluent limitation guidelines for PFAS. Now we need to get them to actually move towards a final policy so we can stop the dumping of these toxic chemicals, not just in North Carolina, but all over the country. So the bottom line is this: we've got a real toxic mess on our hands because of these terrible forever chemicals. But we are making progress, and we have incredible opportunities right in front of us to fight back against the chemical industry and stop this toxic madness before more people's drinking water is contaminated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for that overview and for highlighting some of the ways that we're making progress and can take actions on these issues. On that note, after this call, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a couple of quick actions that you can take both here in North Carolina to call for us to make sure we're cleaning up our PFAS contamination where we can and getting it out of our drinking water to start with, as well as at the national level, thanking the EPA for their proposed action today and calling on them to continue that as well. And we have just a few minutes for one or maybe two questions before we wrap up here. And so I'm going to do my best to combine a few questions that were in the chat. There was a lot of questions about if these PFAS chemicals are so prevalent in our state and in our drinking water and products, what are the things that we as residents can be doing to avoid them? Should we be testing or using filters or avoiding certain produce or products? And what can we be doing in the meantime?
Well, I think in some ways, Katie, this question goes back to right to know. We need to know where chemical companies and manufacturers of other products are using these chemicals. Katie, I know your colleague, Emily Rogers, has been focused on the fact that some high-end sportswear companies like Columbia have even been using PFAS in some of their sportswear equipment. You probably didn't know that when you went to buy a rain jacket. And similarly, I mentioned, food packaging. If you go to buy a hamburger at some fast food joint, did you know that there might have been PFAS? Not just in that sort of a thing. You might think, oh, well, if I go to the groovy, the groovy salad bar with the compostable bowl, that surely that doesn't have PFAS. In fact, sometimes we've found that it does. And so I think one of the key things we need for citizens to take action in their own individual lives is better right to know about when PFAS is in these products, but certainly also just, directly contacting brands that you buy from and demanding that they stop using these toxic chemicals. I hope that's what the spirit of what the question is about.
Yeah, there's a couple of organizations doing great work on consumer sort of activism as well, and folks here in this region can get in, follow North Carolina Conservation Network. They oftentimes post some great links to information about Mind the Store campaigns and things that John was mentioning to to get these big corporations to put the pressure on the even bigger corporations sometimes that are manufacturing these products to stop doing it. And I would suggest also, obviously, number one, just don't cook your food on Teflon coated pans if we're talking about reducing exposure. Try to pay attention to things like folks have been asking the question, and John just mentioned, labeling is necessary. It's not yet happening very well. Pay attention to it. You'll oftentimes see things that say PFOA free. That's greenwashing because PFOA isn't manufactured anymore. There's still PFAS in it. It's just not PFOA. So just, to have that knowledge and to understand that they're going to do what they can to keep making money, and we need to keep putting pressure on them.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And there are a few other questions in the chat. I know that we've been answering some of them as the call have gone on. And if we didn't get to any questions, definitely feel free to follow up with us via email. And in that follow up, we'll also send out our information so you can get in touch with all of us as well. And that will conclude our program for today. So thank you again so much to our speakers for joining us and talking about this important topic. And thank you to Marissa for helping to facilitate our technical aspects of the call today. And thank you all for attending and joining to hear about this and what you can do. And we look forward to keeping up the fight with all of you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Great to
everyone.
see you.
Bye all.